The gunshot split the silence of the dusty Wyoming street like a thunderclap, and Willa Garner didn't even flinch. The bullet hit the wooden post just inches from her face, but her steel blue eyes remained steady, fixed on the man who'd fired the shot. Around her, townsfolk scattered for cover, screaming and diving into doorways. Willa simply stood her ground, her hand hovering near the holster at her hip. "Next time," she called out, her voice carrying across the now empty street. "Make sure you know who you're shooting at, Denton." The year was 1878, and Willa Garner had just arrived in Redemption Creek, a mining town nestled in the Wyoming Territory. At 28, she'd already lived more life than most men twice her age, and the lines around her eyes told stories that her lips never would. "I know exactly who I'm shooting at," shouted Denton, a burly man with a greasy beard and whiskey on his breath. "The woman who stole my claim." Willa sighed, tired of this argument. "The claim was abandoned. I filed the paperwork legal and proper. Your quarrel is with the mining office, not me." "No woman has any right to." His sentence was cut short by the crack of Willa's revolver. The bullet knocked Denton's hat clean off his head, revealing a shiny bald patch. The man staggered backward, his face pale as cream. "Next time," Willa said calmly, holstering her weapon. "I won't be so polite." Denton scrambled to retrieve his hat, muttering curses under his breath before disappearing into the saloon. Slowly, the townspeople emerged from their hiding places, eyeing Willa with a mixture of fear and fascination. She paid them no mind. Willa Garner hadn't come to Redemption Creek to make friends. She'd come to make her fortune, and nothing, not Denton, not the disapproving glances from the town's women, not even the harsh Wyoming winter on the horizon was going to stop her. She continued her walk toward the general store, her boots leaving firm impressions in the dust. The store's bell jingled as she entered, and the proprietor, a thin man with spectacles, looked up from his ledger. "Afternoon, Miss Garner," he said cautiously. "What can I help you with today?" "Need supplies," Willa replied, placing a list on the counter. "Mining equipment, food to last a month, and ammunition." The shopkeeper, Mr. Thompson, scanned the list. "That's quite an order for one person." "One person is all I need." Thompson nodded, used to her brusque manner by now. "I heard the commotion outside. Denton giving you trouble again?" "Nothing I can't handle." She placed a small pouch of gold dust on the counter. "Will that cover it?" "It will." Thompson began gathering her supplies. "You know, Miss Garner, winter comes early up in those mountains. Might be wise to consider waiting until spring." Willa's jaw tightened. "I didn't ask for your advice, Mr. Thompson." "No, madam, you didn't." He sighed. "But folks around here look out for each other. That's how we survive." "I've been surviving just fine on my own for years," Willa said, her voice softening slightly. She'd never been good at accepting concern, always mistaking it for doubt in her abilities. The bell above the door jingled again, and both Willa and Thompson looked up. A tall man in a dusty duster and worn cowboy hat stepped inside, the late afternoon sun casting his face in shadow. "Afternoon," he nodded to Thompson, then his eyes settled on Willa. "Madam." There was something in his deep voice that made Willa straighten her spine. She gave him a cursory nod before turning back to Thompson. "I'll need those supplies delivered to my claim by tomorrow morning." "That's quite a trek up into the mountains, Miss Garner. My delivery boy is laid up with a fever." "Then I'll take what I can carry now and come back for the rest." The stranger cleared his throat. "I've got a wagon outside. I'd be happy to help deliver your supplies." Willa turned to face him fully. Now that he'd stepped away from the door, she could see him clearly. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and wind. His eyes were the color of mountain sage, and a scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into several days' worth of stubble. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense, but there was something arresting about him. "And you are?" she asked. "Preston Xavier," he replied, removing his hat in a gesture of politeness. "Just arrived in town. Looking for work." "Mr. Xavier," Thompson interjected, "might be the answer to both your problems. Miss Garner needs her supplies delivered, and you need work." Willa frowned. She didn't like relying on others, especially men she didn't know. In her experience, accepting help usually came with expectations she wasn't willing to meet. "I'll pay you for your trouble," she said eventually, "but I'll be riding alongside to make sure my supplies arrive intact." Preston nodded. "Fair enough. Thompson busied himself gathering the items on Willa's list while she studied the newcomer. There was something different about him. He didn't leer at her like most men did, nor did he seem intimidated by her directness. "What brings you to Redemption Creek?" she asked. "Change of scenery," Preston replied vaguely. "Spent the last 5 years running cattle in Montana. Time for something new. And delivering supplies to stubborn female miners is your idea of something new?" There was a challenge in her voice. A smile played at the corner of his mouth. "It's a start." Thompson returned with a box of supplies. "This is the first batch. I'll have the rest ready shortly." Preston stepped forward to take the box, his arm brushing against Willa's. She felt an unexpected jolt at the contact and quickly stepped back. "I'll meet you outside," she said curtly, heading for the door. "Don't dawdle." As she stepped out onto the boardwalk, Willa took a deep breath. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, carrying the scents of pine and distant snow from the mountains. Her claim lay 10 miles outside town, high in those mountains, where a vein of silver had been discovered earlier that year. She'd won the claim in a poker game 3 months ago. The previous owner, a drunk more interested in whiskey than wealth, had bet it without thinking he'd lose. His mistake had been Willa's opportunity, and she'd seized it with both hands. Initial tests had shown the vein was promising, not a bonanza, but enough to set her up comfortably if she worked it right. Preston emerged from the store with the box of supplies and headed toward a sturdy wagon hitched to 2 strong horses. "That's a fine team," Willa commented, despite herself. "Thanks," Preston said, loading the box. "Purchased them in Cheyenne last week. They've got good mountain legs. They'll need them. The trail to my claim isn't for the faint-hearted." Preston smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his rugged face. "I've never been accused of having a faint heart, Miss Garner." "Willa," she corrected him, not entirely sure why. "If we're going to be traveling together, might as well use my name." "Willa," he repeated, and something about the way he said it made her stomach tighten. "Then you should call me Preston." They returned to the store to collect the rest of her supplies. It took 3 trips to load everything onto the wagon, and by the time they finished, the sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon. "We should get moving," Willa said, untying her horse from the hitching post. "I want to make it back before dark." "Is that possible?" Preston asked, climbing onto the wagon seat. 10 miles of mountain trail with a loaded wagon. Willa mounted her horse, a spirited mare named Penny. "Not likely, but I don't like the idea of camping out with a stranger." "I understand your caution," Preston said, clicking to his team. "But I assure you, I'm harmless." Willa snorted. "No man I've ever met has been harmless." They set off, the wagon rumbling behind Willa as she led the way out of town. The trail began as a well-traveled road, but soon narrowed and steepened as they ascended into the foothills. The afternoon stretched on, the silence between them punctuated only by the creak of the wagon and the steady rhythm of hooves on hard-packed earth. Occasionally, Willa would glance back to ensure Preston was managing the difficult terrain. Each time, she found him handling the team with confident ease. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Willa reluctantly pulled Penny to a halt. "We'll need to make camp," she announced. "There's a clearing up ahead with a spring." Preston nodded, guiding the wagon off the trail. The clearing was small but level, with a natural spring bubbling from between rocks, creating a small pool before continuing down the mountainside. "I'll see to the horses," Preston offered, already climbing down from the wagon. "I'll handle my own horse," Willa replied, dismounting. She didn't mean to sound ungrateful, but independence was second nature to her. "As you wish." If he was offended, he didn't show it. They worked in silence, setting up separate camps on opposite sides of the clearing. Willa built a small fire and prepared a simple meal of beans and jerky. To her surprise, Preston produced a pot of coffee and 2 tin cups. "Thought you might appreciate some," he said, offering her a steaming cup. The gesture caught her off guard. "Thank you," she said, accepting the coffee. It was strong and hot, exactly what she needed as the mountain air cooled with nightfall. "So," Preston said, settling on a rock near the fire, "what made you decide to become a miner?" Willa sipped her coffee, considering whether to answer or tell him to mind his own business. Something about the quiet night and his unassuming presence made her choose the former. "Freedom," she said finally. "Mining is hard work, but it's honest. And if I strike it rich, I answer to no one but myself. Preston nodded. Freedom's a worthy goal. And what about you? Willa asked. You said you ran cattle in Montana. Why leave? A shadow passed across his face. Sometimes the past catches up with you. Sometimes you need to outrun it. Are you running from the law? He laughed, a rich sound that echoed in the clearing. No, nothing like that. Just ghosts. Willa understood ghosts. She had plenty of her own. Well, as long as your ghosts don't interfere with delivering my supplies, I don't much care what you're running from. Fair enough. Preston tossed the dregs of his coffee into the fire, causing it to hiss. We should get some sleep if we want to reach your claim before midday tomorrow. Willa nodded, retreating to her bedroll. She kept her revolver close, more out of habit than fear of the man across the clearing. As she drifted off to sleep, the last thing she saw was Preston's silhouette against the starlit sky, standing watch over their camp. Morning came with a chill that penetrated Willa's blankets. She awoke to find Preston already up, tending to the horses and brewing fresh coffee. The sky was clear, promising a fine day for travel. Sleep well? He asked, handing her a cup without being asked. Well enough, she replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. We should reach my claim in a few hours. They broke camp efficiently, and soon they were back on the trail, climbing higher into the mountains. The terrain grew increasingly rugged, the trail narrowing until the wagon barely fit between the trees. You weren't exaggerating about this trail, Preston commented as he navigated a particularly steep section. Told you it wasn't for the faint-hearted. Willa couldn't help but feel a twinge of admiration for his skill with the wagon. Most men would have complained or given up by now. They rounded a bend, and suddenly Willa's claim came into view. A small cabin nestled against the mountainside, a stream running nearby, and the entrance to the mine shaft visible as a dark opening in the rock face. Home sweet home, Willa said, without irony. The modest setup represented everything she'd worked for: independence, opportunity, a chance to forge her own destiny. Preston pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the cabin. It's a good spot, he said, surveying the area. Defensible. Water nearby. You chose well. Like I said, I won it in a poker game, but I'd have chosen it if I'd had the chance. Willa dismounted and approached the cabin, checking that everything was as she'd left it. Together, they unloaded the supplies, storing them in the cabin and the small shed beside it. The work went quickly with 2 pairs of hands, and Willa found herself appreciating Preston's help despite her usual aversion to assistance. When the last box was unloaded, Preston dusted off his hands and surveyed the area once more. Well, that should see you through the next month or so. Willa nodded, reaching into her pocket for the payment they'd agreed upon. Thank you for your help. Here's what I owe you. Preston looked at the offered money, then back at her. Actually, I was wondering if you might have use for a partner. Willa's hand froze midair. A partner? Yes. I know my way around mining, did some in California years back. And from the looks of that shaft, it's a 2-person job at minimum. I've managed fine on my own, Willa said automatically, even as she recognized the truth in his words. The mine was becoming harder to work alone as she dug deeper. Preston shrugged. I'm sure you have. But with 2 people, you could extract twice as much or in half the time. Willa frowned, considering his offer. She didn't need him, she didn't need anyone. That had been her mantra for years. But there was a practical logic to his suggestion that she couldn't easily dismiss. Why would you want to partner with me? She asked suspiciously. There are plenty of claims available if you're interested in mining. True, Preston acknowledged. But none that are already showing promise. And none with an owner who clearly knows what she's doing. Flattery wouldn't work on her, but pragmatism might. Willa glanced at the mine entrance, thinking of the silver vein that widened the deeper she dug. With winter approaching, having help would mean extracting more or before the worst weather hit. 50-50 split of whatever we pull out, she said finally. But I maintain ownership of the claim. And this is temporary just until winter sets in. Agreed, Preston said, offering his hand. Partners until winter. Willa hesitated before shaking his hand. His grip was firm, his hand calloused from work. This was purely a business arrangement, she reminded herself. Nothing more. You can bunk in the shed, she said, releasing his hand. It's small, but it's weather-tight. I've got extra blankets in the cabin. Preston nodded. I appreciate it. Shall we take a look at the mine? Willa led the way to the mine entrance. She'd done decent work shoring up the tunnel with timber supports, but it was clear that maintaining it alone had been a challenge. "I followed the vein about 50 feet in," she explained, lighting a lantern. "It's widening as it goes deeper, but I've had to be cautious working alone." Preston examined the nearest support beam. "Good work," he said appreciatively. "Most lone miners don't take the time for proper supports." "I'd rather take longer and stay alive," Willa replied dryly. They ventured into the mine, the lantern casting long shadows against the rock walls. The air grew cooler and damper as they progressed, the sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance. "Here," Willa said, stopping at a spot where the vein of silver was clearly visible in the rock face. "This is where I left off. The assay office in town says it's high-grade ore." Preston ran his hand along the vein, his expression thoughtful. "This is promising. With two of us working, we could extract a significant amount before winter shuts us down." "That's the plan," Willa agreed. "We work until the first heavy snow, then I take what we've accumulated to Denver for smelting." "Denver? That's a long journey in winter. I've made longer in worse conditions." Preston looked like he wanted to argue, but thought better of it. "Well, let's make sure you have plenty to take when the time comes." They emerged from the mine into the bright afternoon sunlight. The day was wearing on, and Willa realized Preston would need to stay the night before heading back to town. "You should water the horses," she said. "I'll prepare something to eat." Preston nodded, leading the team toward the stream. Willa watched him for a moment before heading to the cabin, unsettled by how quickly she'd agreed to his partnership. She'd spent years ensuring she needed no one, and yet here she was, allowing a virtual stranger into her world. But it was just business, she reminded herself. A practical arrangement that benefited them both. Come winter, they'd go their separate ways, and she'd return to the solitude she preferred. As she prepared a simple stew with some of the supplies they'd brought, Willa couldn't help but glance out the window at Preston, who was now chopping wood with efficient strokes. There was something about him that didn't quite fit her image of a drifting cowboy looking for work. His mannerisms, the way he spoke, suggested education and breeding at odds with his rough appearance. "Mysteries aren't my concern," she muttered to herself, "as long as he pulls his weight in the mine." Preston entered the cabin just as Willa was setting the stew to simmer. "Horses are settled, and I've stacked some wood by the door," he said. "Anything else that needs doing?" "No, that's fine. Food will be ready soon." He nodded, looking around the cabin with interest. It was a simple space, one room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the corner, and shelves holding Willa's few possessions. But it was neat and orderly, reflecting her practical nature. "You've made this place comfortable," Preston commented. Willa shrugged. "It serves its purpose." They ate in relative silence, the stew warming them as the mountain air cooled with the setting sun. After dinner, Preston insisted on washing the dishes, a task Willa reluctantly yielded. "We should start work at first light," she said, checking her rifle as she prepared for bed. "The days are getting shorter." "I'll be ready," Preston assured her. He gathered his bedroll and headed for the door. "Good night, Willa." "Good night," she replied, watching as he closed the door behind him. Alone in the cabin, Willa allowed herself a moment of doubt. Had she made a mistake inviting him to stay? But the practical benefits outweighed her misgivings. With Preston's help, she could extract twice as much silver, maybe more. And when winter came, she'd have enough to start a new life somewhere, maybe San Francisco or even back east, where silver could buy respectability if a woman had enough of it. With that thought comforting her, Willa blew out the lamp and settled into her narrow bed, the weight of her revolver a familiar comfort beneath her pillow. True to his word, Preston was ready at first light, already preparing coffee when Willa emerged from the cabin. They worked well together, establishing a rhythm that made the labor less arduous. Preston took the heavier work of swinging the pick and moving or carts, while Willa, with her smaller frame, navigated the narrower sections of the tunnel to place charges. Days turned into weeks, and the pile of ore outside the mine grew steadily larger. Each evening, exhausted but satisfied, they'd return to the cabin where Willa would cook while Preston tended to outside chores. Their conversations, initially limited to the work at hand, gradually expanded to include stories of places they'd been and things they'd seen. Willa learned that Preston had fought in the war between the states as a young man, had panned for gold in California, and had indeed run cattle in Montana until a harsh winter decimated his herd. He spoke of these experiences matter-of-factly, without self-pity or bravado. In turn, she shared parts of her own past growing up in a mining town in Nevada, losing her parents to typhoid when she was 16, and making her way alone in a world that offered few opportunities for women. "How did you learn to shoot like you do?" Preston asked one evening as they sat by the fire, sipping coffee laced with a touch of whiskey. "My father taught me," Willa replied, staring into the flames. "He said a woman on the frontier needed to protect herself. After he died, I practiced every day. Became good enough that men would bet against me in shooting contests. I made a living that way for a while. Until you decided to try mining?" She nodded. "I wanted something more permanent. Something that was mine." Preston studied her in the flickering light. "You've built an impressive life, Willa. Most people would have given up faced with half the challenges you've overcome." His admiration made her uncomfortable. "I did what I had to do." "No," he said softly. "You did more. You thrived where others merely survived." Willa felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire or the whiskey. She wasn't used to compliments, especially ones that recognized her strength rather than her appearance. Most men either saw her as a curiosity or a challenge to be conquered. "We should get some rest," she said, rising abruptly. "Long day tomorrow." Preston nodded, respecting her retreat. "Good night, Willa." As the weeks passed and autumn deepened, Willa found herself increasingly comfortable in Preston's company. His presence had become familiar, even welcome. He never pushed for more than she was willing to give, never treated her as anything less than an equal partner. One crisp morning in late October, they were working deeper in the mine when a sound like distant thunder reached them. "What was that?" Preston asked, pausing with his pick mid-swing. Before Willa could answer, a second rumble shook the tunnel, dislodging small stones from the ceiling. "Cave in," she said, her voice tense. Further in. They exchanged a quick glance before hurrying deeper into the mine, following the sound. As they rounded a bend in the tunnel, they found their path blocked by fallen rock and timber. "The new section we started yesterday," Preston said, examining the collapse. "Thank God we weren't working there today." Willa nodded, relieved but concerned. "This could set us back weeks." Preston studied the damage more closely. "Maybe not. The cave-in isn't as extensive as it first appears. With both of us working, we could clear it in a few days." "If there are no further collapses," Willa said grimly. They retreated to a safer section of the mine to discuss their options. The vein they'd been following was richest in the direction now blocked by the cave-in. Abandoning it would mean significantly less profit, but continuing might be dangerous. "I say we try to clear it," Preston suggested. "Carefully, checking the supports as we go. If there's any sign of further instability, we pull back." Willa considered his proposal. The prudent choice would be to abandon that section and focus elsewhere. But the potential reward was substantial, and with winter approaching, they were running out of time. "All right," she agreed. "But we proceed with extreme caution. No risks." They spent the rest of the day reinforcing the tunnel leading to the cave-in, ensuring they'd have a safe retreat if needed. By evening, both were exhausted but satisfied with their preparations. "We'll start clearing the rockfall tomorrow," Willa said as they walked back to the cabin in the fading light. The first snowflakes of the season were beginning to fall, delicate white flecks against the darkening sky. Willa paused, watching them with a mixture of appreciation and concern. Snow meant their time was running short. "Winter's coming early this year," Preston observed, following her gaze. "All the more reason to work quickly," Willa replied. They reached the cabin just as the snow began to fall more heavily. Inside, the warmth of the fireplace was a welcome relief from the chill. "I'll get dinner started," Willa said, moving to the small stove. Preston nodded, but instead of sitting down, he moved to stand beside her. "Let me help," he offered. Their proximity in the small space made Willa acutely aware of him in a way she usually managed to ignore while working. He smelled of earth and pine, and the heat of his body seemed to reach out to her across the few inches that separated them. "I can manage," she said, her voice not quite steady. Preston stepped back, giving her space. "Of course. I'll check on the horses then." He left, and Willa released the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. What was happening to her? She'd spent years building walls around herself, protecting the vulnerable parts that had been hurt too many times. Yet somehow, Preston was finding cracks in those walls without even trying. The snow continued through the night and into the next day, but it wasn't heavy enough to prevent them from working. They began clearing the cave in, a painstaking process of removing rocks one by one while constantly checking the stability of the surrounding tunnel. By midday, they'd made significant progress. Preston was carefully extracting a large boulder when Willa noticed a thin stream of dirt falling from the ceiling. "Preston, stop," she said sharply. "The ceiling's unstable." He froze, then slowly backed away from the partially cleared passage. No sooner had he moved than a section of the ceiling collapsed, sending a shower of rocks and dirt exactly where he'd been standing. Willa felt her heart lurch. If she hadn't noticed the warning sign, if Preston hadn't reacted so quickly. "That was close," Preston said, dusting himself off. "Thank you for the warning." Willa nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. The realization that she might have lost him shook her more than she cared to admit. "I think we should call it a day," she managed finally. "The whole section might be unstable after this." Preston agreed, and they made their way back to the surface in silence. Outside, the snow had accumulated to several inches, transforming the landscape into a pristine white expanse. "It's beautiful," Preston said, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. Willa had to agree. The mountains, dusted with snow, were majestic against the clear blue sky. Despite her concern about their mining progress, she couldn't help but appreciate the serene beauty of the scene. "Let's check the stream," she suggested. "If it's starting to freeze, we'll need to store extra water." They walked to the stream, which was still flowing but had a thin crust of ice along its edges. As they stood on the bank, Willa slipped on a patch of ice and would have fallen if Preston hadn't caught her, his strong arms wrapping around her waist. Time seemed to stop as she found herself pressed against his chest, his face inches from hers. His eyes, green as sage, held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Careful," he murmured, his voice low. Willa should have pulled away immediately. That would have been the sensible thing to do. Instead, she remained in his embrace for a heartbeat longer than necessary, something unfamiliar and frightening unfurling in her chest. "Thank you," she said, finally stepping back. "We should get back to the cabin." The moment passed, but something had shifted between them. That night, as they sat by the fire, the usual comfortable silence felt charged with unspoken words. "Willa," Preston said eventually, "there's something I need to tell you." She looked up from the book she'd been pretending to read. "What is it?" "I haven't been entirely truthful about why I came to Redemption Creek." Willa tensed. Here it was the revelation that would confirm her instinct never to trust anyone, especially a man with secrets in his eyes. "I wasn't just looking for work," Preston continued. "I was looking for someone. A woman named Eleanor Wilcox. She disappeared from Denver last spring, and her family hired me to find her." "You're a bounty hunter?" Willa asked, surprised. "No, not exactly. I used to be a Pinkerton agent. I left the agency 2 years ago, but I still take private cases occasionally." Willa processed this information. "And this Eleanor, did you find her?" "No." The trail went cold in Cheyenne. "I decided to try Redemption Creek on a hunch, but there's been no sign of her." "So you just happened to be in the general store when I needed help delivering supplies?" There was a note of accusation in her voice. Preston met her gaze steadily. "Yes, that was coincidence. But I saw an opportunity to stay in the area longer, to continue my search." "So our partnership was just a convenient cover for your investigation?" Willa stood, anger rising within her. She'd begun to trust him, to lower her guard, and all along he'd had ulterior motives. "No, Willa, it wasn't like that." Preston rose as well, reaching for her, but she backed away. "Yes, initially I thought it would give me a reason to stay in the area. But that changed. The work, our partnership, it became important to me in its own right. And I'm supposed to believe that?" Willa laughed bitterly. "I've spent my entire life dealing with men who want something from me, who pretend to care until they get what they're after." "I'm not pretending," Preston said quietly. "And I'm telling you the truth now, because I don't want any more lies between us." "There is no us," Willa snapped. "There's a business arrangement that ends when winter arrives. That's all." The hurt that flashed across Preston's face almost made her regret her words, but she steeled herself against it. This was why she didn't let people close they inevitably disappointed her. If that's how you want it, fine, Preston said, his voice tight. But I'm not leaving until we've finished what we started with the mine. I gave my word, and I keep my promises. Fine, Willa agreed coldly. But from now on, we stick to business. The next few days were strained. They worked together efficiently, but without the warmth that had developed between them. Willa maintained a rigid distance, speaking only when necessary about the work at hand. Preston respected her withdrawal, never pushing for more than she was willing to give. But she sometimes caught him watching her with an expression that made her chest ache in a way she refused to examine. The snow continued to fall intermittently, never heavy enough to halt their work, but a constant reminder that their time was limited. They managed to clear the cave in and shore up the tunnel, allowing them to resume following the silver vein. A week after Preston's revelation, disaster struck. They were working deeper in the mine than ever before when a distant rumble warned of another cave-in. This time, there was no time to escape. The tunnel behind them collapsed, trapping them in a small pocket of the mine. Are you hurt? Preston asked immediately, his voice calm despite the dire situation. No, Willa replied, coughing from the dust. I'm fine. But we're trapped. Willa's lantern illuminated their small sanctuary. The cave-in had sealed their exit, leaving them in a space about 10 feet square with no visible way out. The air seemed stable, Preston noted, assessing their surroundings. No draft, but no sign of gas either. Willa nodded, trying to quell the panic rising within her. She'd feared many things in her life, but being buried alive had always been her worst nightmare. We need to conserve the lantern oil, she said, keeping her voice steady through sheer force of will, and see if there's any way to dig out. They examined the fallen rocks, but it quickly became apparent that trying to dig through the collapse would likely trigger further cave-ins. Their best hope was to conserve their resources and wait for help, but who would come looking for them? No one knows we're here, Willa said, voicing the thought aloud. No one will miss us for weeks. Thompson at the general store knows, Preston reminded her. When we don't come for supplies next week, he might send someone to check. It was a slim hope, but better than none. They extinguished the lantern to save oil, plunging them into complete darkness. Willa felt her breathing quicken as the blackness pressed against her like a physical weight. Willa, Preston's voice came from nearby. Are you all right? Yes, she lied, her voice thin. Just thinking. There was a shuffling sound, and then Preston's hand found hers in the darkness. She should have pulled away, maintained the distance she'd insisted on. Instead, she gripped his hand like a lifeline. We'll get out of this, he said with quiet confidence. Together, hours passed in the darkness. They took turns lighting the lantern briefly to check their surroundings and provide momentary relief from the oppressive blackness. They had a small amount of water from Preston's canteen, but no food. Talk to me, Willa, Preston said during one of the dark periods. Tell me something I don't know about you. Why? She asked, though she was grateful for the distraction. Because it passes the time. Because I want to know you better. Because your voice is a damn sight better than listening to rocks settling. Despite herself, Willa smiled in the darkness. What do you want to know? Anything. Everything. Why did you choose to be alone for so long? The question struck deeper than he probably intended. Willa was silent for so long that Preston must have thought she wasn't going to answer. Because it's safer, she said finally. When you rely on yourself, you can't be betrayed. Someone hurt you, Preston observed softly. Many someones, Willa corrected him. My father, who taught me to shoot but couldn't teach himself to stop drinking. My mother, who loved him too much to leave even when his rages turned violent. The man who promised to marry me when I was 18, then disappeared with my savings. The world, which sees a woman alone and assumes she's either a whore or a victim. Her words hung in the darkness between them. Preston's hand tightened around hers. I'm sorry, he said. You deserved better. I don't need pity, Willa said sharply. It's not pity, Preston insisted. It's admiration. You faced all that, and instead of breaking, you grew stronger. You built a life on your own terms. And look where it got me, trapped in a mine with no one but you knowing where I am. Would it be better to be trapped here alone? Preston asked quietly. Willa had no answer for that. The truth was, his presence was the only thing keeping panic at bay. The warmth of his hand in hers, the sound of his voice in the darkness, these things anchored her when fear threatened to consume her. "Your turn," she said instead. "Tell me something I don't know about you." Preston was silent for a moment, considering. "I was married once," he said finally. "Her name was Sarah. She died in childbirth, along with our son. That was 5 years ago." "I'm sorry," Willa said, meaning it. She'd suspected there was loss in his past, but hadn't guessed this particular sorrow. "After they died, I couldn't stay in one place. Kept moving, taking jobs that would keep me busy enough not to think. The Pinkerton work, the cattle ranching, they were just ways to exhaust myself so I could sleep without dreaming." "And now?" Willa asked. "Now," Preston repeated thoughtfully. "For the first time in years, I found something that matters. Someone." The implication hung between them, heavy with significance. Willa felt her heart race. Fear and something else, something she was afraid to name, coursing through her. "Preston," she began, not sure what she intended to say. A noise from beyond the rock fall interrupted her, a faint but distinct tapping sound. "Did you hear that?" Preston asked, instantly alert. They listened intently, and the sound came again, a rhythmic tapping that could only be deliberate. "Someone's out there," Willa breathed, hardly daring to hope. "Someone found us." Preston released her hand and crawled toward the rock fall. "Hello," he shouted. "We're trapped in here." The tapping paused, then resumed with greater intensity. Preston picked up a rock and began tapping back, a simple pattern that the person on the other side copied. "They hear us," he said, excitement in his voice. "They know we're alive." It took hours for their rescuers to clear enough of the fall to create an opening. When finally a shaft of light broke through the darkness, Willa could have wept with relief. The face that appeared in the opening was that of Thompson, the store owner. "Miss Garner? Mr. Xavier? Thank the Lord you're alive. How did you find us?" Preston asked as they helped Willa through the narrow opening first. "When the snow started coming down heavy yesterday, I got worried," Thompson explained. "Figured I'd ride out and check on you. Saw the horses in the corral, but no sign of either of you at the cabin. The mine was the only other place to look." "Yesterday?" Willa asked, blinking in the harsh daylight. "How long were we trapped?" "Nearly 2 days, by my reckoning." 2 days. It had seemed both longer and shorter in the timeless dark of their prison. Willa looked back at Preston as he emerged from the mine, his face grimy, but his eyes finding hers immediately. Something had changed between them in that darkness. Something fundamental that couldn't be undone. Thompson had brought supplies and fresh horses. After they'd washed and eaten, he insisted they return to town with him. "That snow's only going to get worse. You'd be fools to stay up here now." Willa wanted to argue, to insist they could squeeze in a few more weeks of work, but exhaustion and good sense prevailed. They gathered what they could carry, including the substantial pile of silver they'd accumulated, and prepared to leave the claim until spring. As Willa took a last look at the cabin and mine that had been her home and livelihood, she felt Preston come to stand beside her. "We'll come back when the weather breaks," he said softly. "This isn't the end." Willa questioned, turning to face him. "Our arrangement was until winter." Preston held her gaze steadily. "Some arrangements deserve to be reconsidered." The journey back to Redemption Creek was arduous. The snow had deepened considerably, and the trail was treacherous in places. By the time they reached town, darkness had fallen and the temperature had dropped well below freezing. "You both need rest," Thompson said as they stabled the horses. "Miss Garner, Mrs. Thompson has prepared a room for you at our house. Mr. Xavier, the hotel has a vacant room." Willa nodded gratefully, too exhausted to do anything but accept the offer. She glanced at Preston, wondering if he would say something, suggest something else, but he merely nodded as well. "Thank you, Thompson, for everything." They parted ways at the edge of town, Preston heading toward the hotel while Willa followed Thompson to his house. The separation felt strangely painful after their forced proximity in the mine. Mrs. Thompson fussed over Willa, providing hot water for a bath and clean clothes. The comfort was welcome, but as Willa lay in the unfamiliar bed, sleep eluded her. Her mind kept returning to the darkness of the mine, to Preston's hand holding hers, to the words they'd exchanged. "For the first time in years, I found something that matters." Someone. Could she be that someone? Could she allow herself to be? The thought both thrilled and terrified her. To need another person was to be vulnerable, to risk the pain she'd spent years armoring herself against. Morning brought no clarity. Willa rose early, thanked the Thompsons for their hospitality, and headed to the assay office to arrange for the sale of her silver ore. The business of it weighing, calculating, negotiating provided welcome distraction from her churning thoughts. By midday, she'd completed her transactions and secured a substantial sum for the silver. It was enough to see her through the winter, and then some enough to start a new life anywhere she chose. As she left the assay office, she spotted Preston across the street, deep in conversation with the sheriff. He looked up as if sensing her presence, his eyes meeting hers across the distance. Something passed between them, a current of understanding that needed no words. Willa hesitated, then crossed the street toward him. The sheriff, seeing her approach, tipped his hat and moved away. "Good news from the assay office?" Preston asked. "Very good," Willa confirmed. "The ore was high grade. We did well." "You did well," Preston corrected her. "It was your claim, your knowledge that made it successful." "We were partners," Willa insisted. "Your help made it possible to extract twice what I could have alone." She reached into her pocket and withdrew half the money she'd received. "Your share." Preston looked at the money, then back at her face. "I didn't do it for the money, Willa. Nevertheless, you earned it." He accepted the payment with a nod of thanks. "What will you do now? With winter setting in, the mine will be inaccessible until spring." It was the question Willa had been asking herself all morning. Before meeting Preston, the answer would have been simple: find comfortable lodgings in a larger town, perhaps Denver or Cheyenne, and wait out the winter before returning to her solitary life in the mountains. Now, nothing seemed simple. "I haven't decided," she admitted. "What about you? Will you continue looking for Eleanor Wilcox?" Preston shook his head. "I received word this morning. She's been found alive and well in San Francisco. She'd run away to start a new life, away from a controlling family. The case is closed." "So you're free to move on," Willa said, trying to keep disappointment from her voice. "I'm free to choose," Preston corrected her. "And I find myself inclined to stay in Redemption Creek. At least for the winter." Willa's heart quickened. "Why would you do that?" "I think you know why." They stood in the snowy street, the bustle of the town continuing around them as if nothing momentous was occurring. But for Willa, the world had narrowed to this moment, this choice. "I don't need anyone, Preston," she said finally, the words coming out less certain than she'd intended. "I know," he replied simply. "That's part of what I admire about you. You don't need anyone. But maybe, just maybe, you might want someone." The distinction struck her. Need had always felt like weakness to Willa, a vulnerability she couldn't afford. But one was different. One was choice. One was possibility. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted quietly. "I've been alone for so long." Preston stepped closer, not touching her, but near enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "We can figure it out together. No rush, no pressure. Just two people who found something unexpected in a silver mine." A smile tugged at Willa's lips despite her lingering fear. "Something unexpected," she repeated. "That's one way of putting it." "Have dinner with me tonight," Preston suggested. Not as business partners, as two people who might want to know each other better. It was such a small step, such a simple request. And yet to Willa, it felt momentous, a door opening to a path she'd long ago decided never to walk. "All right," she agreed, surprising herself. "Dinner." The smile that lit Preston's face was worth the flutter of anxiety in her chest. "I'll call for you at the Thompsons at 7. Willa nodded and turned to go, needing time to process this unexpected turn of events. She'd taken only a few steps when Preston called after her. "Willa," she looked back. "Thank you for trusting me enough to try." Those simple words followed her throughout the day, echoing in her mind as she purchased new clothes, her first dress in years, and allowed Mrs. Thompson to help arrange her hair. Trust had never come easily to her, yet somehow Preston had earned it, not by demanding or cajoling, but by offering his own trust first. When he arrived that evening, dressed in clean clothes with his hair neatly combed, Willa felt a flutter of something she barely recognized as happiness. They walked to the town's best restaurant, a modest establishment that nonetheless offered tablecloths and candles with their frontier fare. Conversation flowed more easily than Willa had expected. Outside the context of the mine, They discovered shared interests, books they'd both read, places they'd both visited, dreams they'd both harbored. Preston made her laugh with stories of his cattle-driving days, and she found herself sharing memories of her childhood that she'd long kept buried. "I never thought I'd enjoy dressing up and dining out," Willow admitted as they lingered over coffee. "I've spent so long being practical, focusing on survival." "There's more to life than surviving," Preston said gently. "There's thriving, enjoying, connecting." "Is that what we're doing? Connecting?" "I hope so." His eyes held hers, warm and sincere. "I think we connected the moment you didn't shoot me for offering to help deliver your supplies." Willa laughed, the sound surprising her. "I considered it briefly." "I'm glad you reconsidered." As they walked back to the Thompsons' house, snow began to fall again, soft flakes that caught in Willa's hair and on Preston's broad shoulders. The town was quiet, most residents already in for the night, giving them a sense of privacy as they strolled through the white, dusted streets. At the Thompsons' gate, Willa hesitated. The evening had been pleasant, more than pleasant, but what came next? "I enjoyed tonight," Preston said, seeming to sense her uncertainty. "So did I," Willa admitted. "May I call on you again tomorrow?" It was such an old-fashioned, courtly request that Willa almost laughed. Instead, she found herself nodding. "I'd like that." Preston smiled, and for a moment Willa thought he might kiss her. Part of her wanted him to, while another part was relieved when he simply took her hand and pressed it gently. "Until tomorrow, then." Willa watched him walk away, snowflakes swirling in his wake. She touched her hand where the warmth of his lingered, wondering at the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she would have scoffed at the idea of allowing anyone into her carefully constructed world. Now, she found herself looking forward to seeing Preston again. The days that followed established a new pattern. Preston called on Willa each day, and they spent time together walking through town, sharing meals, or simply sitting by the fire in the Thompsons' parlor, talking. Each interaction stripped away another layer of the armor Willa had built around herself, revealing the woman beneath, not just the tough miner or the self-sufficient survivor, but a person with dreams, fears, and desires. A week after their return to town, a blizzard hit Redemption Creek, confining everyone to their homes for 3 days. Willa found herself missing Preston's company with an intensity that should have frightened her, but instead felt strangely right. When the storm finally broke and Preston appeared at the Thompsons' door, snow-dusted and grinning, Willa felt something within her shift and settle. Without thinking, she stepped forward and embraced him, her arms wrapping around his solid warmth. Preston froze for a moment in surprise before his arms came around her, holding her close but not too tight, as if giving her room to retreat if she needed to. "I missed you," she said, the words muffled against his coat. "I missed you too," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "These were the longest 3 days of my life." When she pulled back to look at him, his expression was so full of tenderness that Willa felt her last defenses crumbling. She reached up, touching his face, tracing the scar along his jawline with gentle fingers. "Preston," she said softly, not quite a question but an invitation. He understood, lowering his head to kiss her with a gentleness that brought tears to her eyes. It wasn't her first kiss, but it was the first that felt like coming home rather than losing herself. When they separated, both a little breathless, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the moment I saw you standing your ground against Denton in the middle of the street." Willa laughed softly. "I would have shot you if you tried it then." "I know," he grinned. "Your timing is much better than mine." Their relationship deepened as winter settled fully over Redemption Creek. They spent Christmas with the Thompsons, exchanging modest gifts, a new notebook and pen for Preston, who Willa had discovered enjoyed writing, a delicate silver pendant for Willa, crafted from the first piece of, or they'd extracted together. By January, Willa had taken lodgings of her own, a small apartment above the milliner's shop. Preston remained at the hotel, respecting her need for independence even as they grew closer. "Have you thought about what you'll do when spring comes?" Preston asked one evening as they sat by the fire in her apartment. Willa had been thinking of little else. "Return to the mine, I suppose. There's still plenty of silver to be extracted." Alone, the question hung between them, weighted with meaning. Willa studied Preston's face, seeing the hope he was trying to conceal beneath casual inquiry. I don't know, she answered honestly. What are your plans? Preston set aside the book he'd been pretending to read. My plans depend largely on you, Willa. Why? She asked, though she knew the answer. Because I love you, he said simply. I want to build a life with you, whether that's working the mine or doing something else entirely. The words should have terrified her. Instead, they filled a space inside her that had been empty for so long she'd forgotten it existed. I've spent my whole life believing I was too strong to need anyone, Willa said slowly. That needing someone was weakness. And now, Preston prompted gently, now I think perhaps the strongest thing I've ever done is allow myself to care for you. Willa met his gaze steadily. To love you. The words, once spoken, felt right like a truth she'd been carrying without recognizing it. Preston crossed the room to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. Then marry me, he said, his voice earnest. Be my partner in all things, not just mining. Let me be yours. Willa looked into his face, this man who had respected her strength, who had held her when she needed holding but never tried to cage her, who had seen past her carefully constructed walls to the woman beneath. Yes, she said, the words simple but profound. Yes, I'll marry you. The kiss that followed sealed their promise. A meeting of equals who had chosen each other not from need, but from want, not from weakness, but from strength. They were married in February, a small ceremony in the town's church with the Thompsons as witnesses. Willa wore a simple blue dress that matched her eyes, and Preston wore a new suit purchased for the occasion. Their vows were traditional, but spoken with a depth of meaning that brought tears to Mrs. Thompson's eyes. As winter began to loosen its grip on the mountains, they made plans. They would return to the mine when the trails cleared, but not to live there permanently. Instead, they purchased land closer to town, where Preston began building a house, not a cabin, but a proper home with multiple rooms and large windows to capture the mountain views. It seems extravagant, Willa commented as they reviewed the plans together. Think of it as investing in our future, Preston replied. A place to build a life, maybe raise a family someday. If you want. The thought of children, once so far removed from Willa's vision of her future, now seemed like a natural extension of the love she shared with Preston. I'd like that, she admitted. Not right away, but someday. Spring arrived with the promise of new beginnings. The snow retreated up the mountainsides, wildflowers began to bloom in the meadows, and the trail to Willa's claim became passable once more. They rode up together on a bright April morning, Preston leading a pack mule laden with supplies. The familiar landscape looked different somehow, not just because of the changing season, but because Willa viewed it through new eyes. What had once been merely her territory, her livelihood, was now part of a shared future. The cabin stood just as they'd left it, though winter winds had damaged one corner of the roof. Inside, everything remained undisturbed, a testament to the respect locals had for property rights, even in the wilderness. Feels strange, being back, Willa commented as they unpacked. Good strange or bad strange? Preston asked. She considered the question. Different strange. This place was my independence, my fortress. Now it's just a place where we work. Is that a loss? Preston's voice was gentle, free of judgment. No, Willa realized, smiling at him. It's a gain. I haven't lost my independence, I've added something more. They spent 2 weeks at the mine, repairing the damage from the winter and assessing the remaining silver deposits. The veins still showed promise, enough to provide a comfortable income for several more years if carefully managed. Working together, they developed a new routine: 3 weeks at the mine, 1 week at their home in progress near town. It was a balanced life that allowed Willa the wilderness she loved while providing the community connections Preston valued. By summer, their house was completed, a beautiful 2-story structure with a wide porch facing the mountains. They moved in on a warm June day, carrying their few possessions into spaces that seemed vast after the cramped confines of the cabin and their temporary lodgings in town. What do you think? Preston asked as they stood in the empty front room, sunlight streaming through the windows. Willa looked around, imagining the future that would unfold within these walls. I think it's perfect, she said, leaning into his embrace. It's our home. That evening, sitting on the porch as the setting sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Willa reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From the solitary woman who'd stood unflinching before a gunman to the partner and wife who had learned that strength could include vulnerability, that independence didn't preclude connection. "What are you thinking?" Preston asked, his arm around her shoulders. "I'm thinking about strength," Willa replied. "About how I spent so many years thinking I was too strong to need anyone. But real strength isn't about standing alone. It's about choosing to stand with someone." Preston pressed a kiss to her temple. "You're the strongest person I've ever known, Willa Xavier. And I'm grateful every day that you chose to share that strength with me." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Willa settled more comfortably against her husband's side. The future stretched before them, full of possibilities: the mine, their home, perhaps children someday. But whatever came, they would face it together. And in that togetherness, Willa had found not the weakness she had always feared, but a deeper, truer strength than she had ever known alone.